So we're just basically we're cutting a key in, so that would help to reduce any parting defects. Now this is a quite simple mould, so I don't really have to do too much thinking, happily. Sometimes with moulds, spend a lot of time just poring over the pattern so that you have it in your head, an idea of where you're going to cut around the actual pattern to make it as easy as possible to open the mould and therefore get a decent wax out. Now this one in here should be, if I remember rightly, a 4mm scale dome. And it's a replacement for an old natural rubber mould that is defunct. So I keep on cutting zigzags in there to just again aid location. We're at the dome now.
Can you just turn that to camera just so we can see where the dome is there? Maybe just bring it. That's it, that's brilliant.
Take the dome out. So then we can do a nice straight cut through the nut on the top. And then everything else is just basically zigzags. And then we'll just put some vents in, just allows the air to be released. Don't always need to do this, but it just becomes a bit of a habit. Right, so we now have a mould. We're going to dust the mould with talcum powder, which is basically acting as a release agent, and allows the mould to part, allows the vents to allow any air that might be trapped in the mould to get out before we produce the wax. As I said, this is quite a simple mould. What we'll do is we'll run 1 or 2 moulds and you'll be able to see some waxes come out of each of the moulds. So we're now going to put the mould onto the wax injector. This is a fancy wax injector, it's called a vacuum wax injector. It initially sucks the air out of the mould and then injects the wax into the mould. There are various different types available. This just happens to be one of the ones that I have. So we'll take the mould, we set the pressure. So if you watch the gauge at the top, you got the gauge in the top? Yeah. Watch the gauge at the top. So I will set the pressure that I think will be suitable for this mould. Right, so we insert it into the machine, press the button, clamps the mould, vacuum first, and then go across to inject the wax. So usually I'm running a selection of mould somewhere between 10 and 12 moulds, so that by the time I've filled all of the moulds and we come back to the first mould, the wax will have congealed and solidified, ready to remove from the mould. So, but we will take a chance on this one, and we shall open it. Take the top off. So, wax. And then we have a wax of our original dome. Okay, and then we would continue throughout until we've got the quantities that we require of each different item. Right, so now after the stage of making waxes, we have trays of waxes, and these need to be attached to create what we call a tree. So using basically an old soldering iron, melt the wax, attach to tree, and similarly again. We slope them upwards, obviously, because the metal then has an easy flow. And in that manner we continue to build it up. Don't want them too close together, obviously, because the metal could then burst through the plaster, and you end up with two domes joined together, which wouldn't be of any use to anybody. And thus the metal would end up in the melting pot again and being reused. And so on until we've created a tree. Now, in pure Blue Peter manner, here's one that we prepared earlier, which has a variety of items on there that most of you will recognise. Salter valves, steam heat pipes, chimneys, Ross Pop safety valves. These are Johnson smoke box door in front, and some Ramsbottom safety valves there. For a particular customer, these are in 4mm scale, and so that's why you can see a lot more on the tree. At this point we need to work out exactly how much metal we need to fill all of the casting cavities. So what we do is we weigh. We have weights already on the base, so that is the weight of the base. So we put that onto the scales, gives us an amount, in this case 156 grams. So we put 156, take away the weight of the base, minus 110, and then we multiply it by the specific gravity of, in this case, brass, which is 9. Because the wax, the specific gravity of wax is 1. So we'll be using the specific gravity of the metal, brass, which is 9. So we multiply it by 9. See, I've just done that wrong. You'll be able to chop this, won't you?
Yeah.
That's okay. Right.
Yeah,
So
I'll do a pick up again.
5, 6 minus 110 times 9 equals. So we require 414 grams of brass. Plus, I usually add another 20 grams for what I call the button. And when you see it, when I show you a finished tree of castings, you'll see this button on the bottom, which is like a reservoir of metal. So the amount that we actually require will be 434 grams. And I write that on to the flasks. And the flask is placed around the waxes. so. Just make sure none of the waxes are touching the sides, and there we have them in the flask. So again, now in this one, which has heavy parts in, flask base is 135, onto there, yeah, so it's 195 minus 135 times by 9 gives us 540 plus 20, which would be 560. But as these are heavy parts, in my case, I'll usually put HVY on there just to remind me, because these parts will have to be cast at a lower temperature. Otherwise we'll end up with porosity in the castings. Okay, so with the actual temperatures of both the metal and the flask will be at a lower temperature when it comes to cast the parts. Right, so the flasks then are taken and put into this machine, and this machine mixes the investment, which is essentially plaster, under vacuum. And the reason that it mixes it under vacuum is so that when it fills the flasks, we don't get any trapped air nodules in there, because when the wax is melted out, you will end up with that, where that air pocket was, the metal will fill that. So sometimes you'll see castings and there's a tiny little nodule on there. That's because all of the air hasn't been sucked out during the mixing of the investment at this stage. Okay. Right, so we'll just swing the lid across and lower it onto the seal. So this is built up with two chambers. We've seen the bottom chamber where the flasks have gone. The top chamber is a mixing machine, effectively, and then we have ball valves between the two machines. This, once we've put the water in, and then we add the plaster and mix under vacuum, it will mix it all under vacuum, and then we'll open the bottom valves to allow the plaster into each of the flasks, and then they will be set to one side to set. So wax flows and fills, sorry, the plaster flows and fills the flask. Turn the turntable, do the next one, similar manner, and all of this has to be done in an 8-minute period. From as soon as the plaster hits the water, then you've got to be pay attention. Yeah, that served me right, that did. As these have to wait for an hour and a half to set, again in Blue Peter fashion, I prepared one earlier to show you exactly how it's done. Now the weight that is written on here will be written on a whiteboard. We'll show a picture of it in a little while, so that we know which flask has to have how much metal. Otherwise you could have too much metal or too little metal to fill the cavities. Once they're set and we've written the weights onto the board, we can remove the tape and then the flask goes into the kiln. So all of the flask will go into the kiln. Kiln's closed. We have a set program, so if I ramp through the program for you, we can go, that's starting, so we'll go. The wax is actually melted out and burned away overnight, over about a 12-hour period. So it goes through a whole program. So I'll just briefly, you'll be able to see it on the screen there, the little red dots going up the screen as it ramps up to its highest temperature of 740 degrees. It will hold it there for 5 hours, and then it will ramp down to, in the case here, was 640 degrees, but that will probably be taken down in the case of these bits and pieces down to around about 560 degrees for when we cast. So we can then start the kiln, and it will do all of its process overnight. In the bottom of the kiln, it's slanted, and the wax, the main amounts of wax actually melt out and flow into this collecting tray underneath. So it's only the remaindered wax inside that actually burns away to carbon monoxide and carbon dioxide. And that will be 12 hours later, we will be casting, which will be the next morning. Beforehand, we have to weigh out the appropriate amount of metal for each flask, which we do by putting a quantity of new metal and perhaps a quantity of old reject castings, or the sprues can be mixed in. No more than 50% old metal with 50% new metal, otherwise the castings can be ropey at best. So we have the mixture until we get the correct amount of brass, and then from that point that metal will then go into the crucible on the casting machine, and we'll be doing castings in the morning. Okay. The metal is then put into the crucible inside the casting machine. This is the casting machine that we have here. Inside is a crucible, and the crucible actually has a hole in the centre, and there's a rod. It's a graphite crucible, a graphite rod, which is blocking that hole in the centre of the crucible. The metal is placed inside, lid is closed and clamped down. There is a gas blanket of nitrogen over the top to keep down any oxidation possible inside the chamber. So we'll turn the nitrogen on, and then we turn the machine on, and if you watch this dial here, shall we say, you'll watch the temperature rise in the crucible. So there's now heat going to the crucible. It's called induction heating. It's a copper coil around the crucible through which water is going through it to keep the coil cool, and there's an alternating magnetic field, which is called induction, which makes the molecules of the graphite crucible rub together to create heat, and that will give us the heat that we require. Once it gets up to the correct temperature and the metal's molten, then we will remove the flask from the kiln, which will be placed in the bottom chamber, and then we'll just turn the knob, and you'll see the rod would rise and the metal flows out the bottom and fills all of those cavities that were originally filled with wax. So hence the name lost wax is actually the wax is lost from the process. Okay, so it's heating up at the moment. You can see there it's coming up to 500 degrees. It's going to get to 1080 degrees, okay, before we use it in this particular case. So the crucible is starting to glow red. We'll get some film of that in a moment. Right, we've got to the kiln, to the flask. bottom chamber. The flask then goes into here. Lifted against the bottom. Watch this gauge here. This bottom chamber is then put under vacuum, so that when the metal goes in, the vacuum assists it to fill the nooks and crannies in that rod. Then we turn this knob, which raises the rod, frees the metal to go into the flask. Then we can close that rod once again to put the next charge of metal in for the next cast. In the meantime, we can take the flask out of here, put it so it's no longer, release the vacuum, take the flask out of here, it says, come on, come with Daddy. Doesn't normally do that. When we place it to one side to cool. Once the flasks have been allowed to cool, they then go through into a blasting off cabinet, where a pressure washer is used to blast the plaster off the castings, and then they go through various different dips to clean the castings up, and then they're set to one side, usually in the open mouth of the kiln in my case, to dry, and then I bring them in here and I sit and I cut them off. So what we've done is we have some earlier ones prepared for you to see. We have a tree of throat plates for a particular locomotive, and these are various coach fittings for, I think these are SECR birdcage coaches. So you get a chance to see what the finished castings look like, and then we sit with an appropriate pair of cutters, these are Nipex, and we get in and cut the castings off into their respective piles. They go into plastic bags and go off to the customers for them to put in their kits or otherwise.